Have you ever woken up in the middle of the night with a strange feeling? That moment when your mind seems clearer, more lucid than during the day, when the layers of distraction dissipate and you wonder if you are truly living the life you were meant to live. It is fascinating how in these moments of sudden clarity, we simultaneously feel a deeper connection with our own existence and an unsettling discomfort, as if truly waking up had a price, as if every step toward what we call consciousness, awakening, distanced us from something that also has value. We rarely stop to consider what we lose when we gain clarity. We are so focused on what it means to be awake that we forget to honor what we leave behind in the process. There is a certain beauty in the mist, a functionality in illusion, a purpose in unconsciousness that our stubborn desire for lucidity often prevents us from appreciating. What are we really losing when we awaken? What do we sacrifice on the altar of expanded consciousness? For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors lived without the modern compulsion to constantly question their own lives. Paleolithic hunter-gatherers did not wake up every morning wondering whether they were fulfilled in their careers or whether their relationships met their emotional expectations. They simply lived according to the established rhythms of their communities and environments. Life had more immediate urgencies. Survival was a full-time occupation. There is something deeply integrated in this way of existing that our hyper-conscious society can no longer access. When you are fully absorbed by the immediate need to find food, to protect your group from predators, or to navigate a storm, you experience a form of presence that is not mediated by layers of reflection. It is a state of being that does not know the existential anxiety that characterizes modern consciousness. As human civilization evolved, we began creating distance between ourselves and this direct form of existence. Agriculture gave us surpluses that allowed free time, and with that free time came reflection. The great religions emerged, offering comprehensive narratives that answered the existential questions we began to ask. Who are we? Why are we here? What happens after death? These narratives provided comfort and meaning. They offered certainties in a world full of uncertainties. When you believed without doubt that there is a God who created the universe, who has a plan for your life, and who will receive you into an eternal realm after death, you experienced a form of existential security that is almost inaccessible to the modern awakened mind. It is ironic that when we speak of awakening, we often refer to an expansion of consciousness, a greater ability to perceive the complexities and contradictions of human existence. But this expansion comes at a cost. Each layer of consciousness we acquire distances us a little more from the simplicity of being, from the unquestioned acceptance of life as it presents itself. We think we are advancing, but in certain aspects, we are moving away from something fundamental. The history of humanity can be seen as a successive series of awakenings, each taking us further from the original integration with the simple flow of life. With the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution, we experienced another collective awakening. We began to question the religious narratives that had sustained our understanding of the world for millennia. We replaced the certainty of faith with the curiosity of scientific inquiry. We gained knowledge, precision, technology, and unprecedented control over our environment. But we also lost something. We lost the feeling of living in an enchanted world where rivers had spirits, where lightning was an expression of divine anger, where every event, no matter how trivial or tragic, had meaning within a broader cosmic plan. Max Weber called this the disenchantment of the world. When we explain the rainbow as light refraction, it ceases to be a bridge to the realm of the gods or a divine promise. It becomes physics, precise, explainable, but in a certain way diminished. I am not suggesting that we should reject science and return to mythical explanations of the world. Far from it. Scientific knowledge has brought extraordinary advances that have improved our lives in countless ways. I am simply acknowledging that there is a trade-off, that each new layer of consciousness both reveals and obscures. Perhaps the most powerful example of this trade-off comes from psychology. Freud and his successors awakened us to the complexities of the human mind, to the impulses and desires that inhabit our unconscious, to the behavioral patterns we repeat without realizing it. This awakening gave us tools to better understand our motivations, to treat mental disorders, to build healthier relationships, but it also robbed us of the ability to simply be without constantly analyzing our thoughts and behaviors. Psychological self-awareness is a double-edged sword. It frees us from dysfunctional patterns, but it can also trap us in endless cycles of analysis and doubt. Think of small children who have not yet developed dense layers of reflective consciousness. They are capable of a total absorption in the present moment that many adults can only achieve in rare instances, often through practices like meditation or peak experiences. A child playing is not wondering whether they are playing correctly, whether they look ridiculous, or whether they should be doing something else. They are simply playing, completely absorbed in the experience. There is a freedom in this that we lose as we mature and awaken to the complexities and social judgments of life. Modern neurosis is in large part a product of this excess of consciousness. We are constantly observing ourselves, judging our actions against internalized standards, comparing our lives with those of others, questioning our choices. This creates a distance between us and our own experience. Instead of simply living, we are always watching ourselves live, and this internal division is a source of suffering. Philosopher Alan Watts described this as the feeling of being simultaneously the actor and the audience in our own drama, never fully immersed in the role because we are too busy evaluating our performance. The irony is that many spiritual traditions seek a different kind of awakening, one that would bring us back to a more direct and integrated form of experience. Zen Buddhism, for example, speaks of the beginner's mind, a state in which we observe the world without the distortions of our accumulated concepts, judgments, and expectations. The paradox is that this kind of awakening requires that we fall asleep to many of the layers of consciousness we consider markers of intellectual and psychological sophistication. We must unlearn to achieve this deeper clarity. However, In our contemporary society, we see an opposite trend. With every new technological advancement, with every new social media platform, with every new opportunity for consumption, we are moving even further from direct experience and entering increasingly dense layers of mediation and reflexivity. We are constantly photographing ourselves, living instead of simply living. We are documenting experiences instead of feeling them fully. We are consuming the representation of life instead of life itself. I need to pause for a moment and ask you directly, which aspect of this constant awakening most awakens your fear or apprehension? Do you lie down at night thinking about this too? I know we often keep these concerns to ourselves, perhaps out of fear of appearing paranoid or technophobic in a world that celebrates every new innovation without question. But your worries are valid and probably shared by more people than you imagine. Share in the comments. My biggest fear about our increasingly conscious future is your voice may help create a space where we can honestly discuss these collective fears instead of suppressing them. And perhaps by naming these fears together, we can begin imagining ways to face them. Artificial intelligence represents the next great awakening of humanity, one that promises to expand our collective consciousness beyond its current limits. We are creating systems that can process and analyze quantities of information that far exceed the capacity of the human brain. We are developing algorithms that can identify patterns that escape our perception. We are building interfaces that allow us to access knowledge and communication in increasingly immediate and integrated ways. All of this is awakening us to dimensions of reality that were previously beyond our capacity for perception. But what are we losing in this process? As we increasingly rely on external systems to think for us, are we losing certain cognitive abilities? Studies suggest yes. Our capacity for memory, for spatial navigation, for sustained attention all seem to be affected by constant use of digital technology. More deeply, we are losing forms of knowledge that cannot be captured by algorithms and databases. The embodied knowledge that comes from doing something with your own hands repeatedly over time. The intuitive knowledge that arises from long immersion in a particular field or practice. The relational knowledge that emerges from direct contact with other people without the mediation of screens and interfaces. There is something particularly concerning about the way digital technology is restructuring our experience of time. We live in a state of perpetual distraction, jumping from one notification to another, from one feed to another, rarely allowing our attention to settle deeply on anything. This fragmentation of consciousness has profound implications. It affects our ability to form coherent memories, to build meaningful narratives about our lives, to experience the kind of deep immersion that leads to creative discoveries and genuine connections. Philosopher Bernard Stiegler argued that we are living in a crisis of attention in which our capacity for sustained attention is being systematically captured and fragmented by systems designed to monetize every moment of our consciousness. It is not just that we are distracted, it is that our distraction has become a commodity, something to be bought and sold on the global market. In this process, we lose autonomy over our own consciousness. We awaken to a world of infinite possibilities for information and communication, but we fall asleep to our ability to determine the focus of our own attention. Another aspect of what we lose when we awaken is related to community and belonging. In traditional societies, identity was something given, determined by birth, by place, by family, by religion. There were limitations in these prescribed identities, certainly, especially for those who did not fit dominant expectations. But there was also an existential safety in knowing your place in the world, in having a clear set of values and practices shared with those around you, in feeling part of something greater than yourself. As we awaken to the multiplicity of ways of being, to the historical and cultural contingency of our identities and values, we gain freedom and possibility. We can choose who we want to be. We can question traditions. We consider oppressive or limiting. We can create new forms of community based on affinity rather than proximity. But we also lose something profound. We lose the sense of unquestionable belonging, the safety of clear boundaries, the comfort of definitive answers. The sociologist Zygmunt Bauman called our era liquid modernity, characterized by the dissolution of stable social structures and the continual need for self-invention. We are always in flux, always becoming, never simply being. This creates a permanent anxiety, a feeling that we are never doing enough, never becoming enough, never reaching the imaginary destination where we can finally rest in the certainty of who we are. It is important to note that this liquidity does not affect everyone equally. Those with sufficient material and cultural resources may experience it as freedom, as an opportunity for self-expression and exploration. Those without these resources often experience the same liquidity as precariousness, as a lack of support structures, as an impossible demand for constant adaptation to rapidly changing circumstances. The awakening of collective consciousness does not happen uniformly or equitably. Another aspect of what we lose when awakening is related to our relationship with nature. For hundreds of thousands of years, human beings lived in intimate contact with the natural world. Our bodies and minds evolved in savanna, forest, coastal, and mountain environments. Our sensory perception, our biological rhythms, our emotional psychology, all were shaped by this immersion in nature. As we build increasingly elaborate artificial environments, as we mediate our experience of the world through layers of technology, we lose this direct connection with the natural systems that sustain us and of which we are part. This disconnection has obvious practical consequences, such as the climate crisis and the sixth mass extinction we are witnessing. When we do not directly experience our dependence on natural systems, it becomes easier to ignore the signs of stress in these systems. But it also has more subtle psychological and spiritual consequences. What has been called nature deficit disorder is linked to increases in mental health problems, particularly anxiety, depression, and attention deficit. There is something in the direct sensory experience of the natural world that nurtures our well-being in ways we are only beginning to understand scientifically, but that traditional cultures have always intuitively recognized. As we awaken to a sophisticated scientific understanding of the natural world, we gain extraordinary knowledge about the physical, chemical, and biological processes that sustain life. We can map genomes, model ecosystems, predict climate patterns, but we lose the direct sensory experience of being part of nature, of feeling the rhythm of the seasons in the body, of knowing a place so intimately that every subtle change is noticeable, of identifying plants and animals not by their scientific names in a book, but through repeated encounters over time. This awakening to abstract knowledge, accompanied by a falling asleep to embodied experience, is particularly evident in our relationship with food. We know more than ever about nutrition, about the biochemical components of foods, about the global supply chains that bring products to our tables. But most people in industrialized societies have little or no direct experience with growing food, with preparing meals from basic ingredients, with the seasonal rhythm of the availability of different plants and animals. We awaken to the science of nutrition, but fall asleep to the culture of food, to the embodied knowledge of how food connects humans to each other and to the earth. There is also something profound we have lost regarding death. In traditional societies, death was a constant and visible presence. People died at home, surrounded by family. Bodies were prepared for burial by loved ones. Mourning rituals were elaborate and shared. There was a familiarity with death, an acceptance of its inevitability that allowed it to be integrated into the experience of life more fully. In our modern societies, we awaken to extraordinary medical interventions that prolong life, to detailed understandings of the biological processes of death. But we fall asleep to the direct experience of death as part of life. We isolate the dying in hospitals and nursing homes. We hand over the care of the dead to professionals. We avoid talking about death, treating it as a technical failure to be indefinitely postponed, rather than a transition to be faced with dignity and meaning. This awakening to the possibility of prolonging life, accompanied by a falling asleep to the acceptance of death, creates a peculiar form of anxiety. We live longer than our ancestors on average, but often with more fear of death, with fewer cultural and spiritual resources to give meaning to our finitude. Paradoxically, this denial of death can diminish our capacity to live fully. When we try to avoid the awareness of our mortality, we may also fall asleep to the preciousness of each moment, to the urgency of living according to our deepest values, to the importance of expressing love and gratitude while we still can. One of the most disturbing aspects of what we lose when awakening is related to privacy and interiority. As our lives become increasingly digitized and connected, we awaken to unprecedented possibilities for communication and sharing. We can instantly transmit our thoughts, feelings, and experiences to global audiences. We can connect with people who share our most specific interests, no matter where they are in the world. We can document and archive every aspect of our lives, but in this process, we are losing something crucial: the protected space of privacy, where interiority can develop. The writer and philosopher Iris Murdoch spoke of the importance of the unseen work of consciousness, the internal process of reflection, contemplation, and moral development that happens out of sight of others. In the age of social media, there is constant pressure to externalize, to turn thoughts and feelings into content, to be shared and consumed. This pressure for constant externalization affects not only what we choose to share, but also what we choose to perceive and value in the first place. We begin to experience our lives through the lens of their shareability. A sunset becomes an opportunity for an Instagram photo. A moment of accomplishment becomes a LinkedIn post. An intimate reflection becomes a tweet. In this process, our attention is trained to value what can be displayed and rewarded with social approval to the detriment of what may be meaningful only internally, invisible to others. Moreover, constant surveillance, both by corporations and governments, is eroding the very possibility of privacy. Our devices track our location, our browsing habits, our purchases, our conversations. Algorithms analyze this data to predict and influence our behavior. We awaken to a world of unprecedented convenience and personalization, but fall asleep to the autonomy that comes from having a mental space that is unmonitored, unmediated, unmonetized. The paradox here is that the more transparent we become, the more our lives are recorded, archived, and analyzed, the less we know ourselves in certain fundamental ways. Self-knowledge requires privacy. It requires space to experiment, to make mistakes, to contemplate possibilities that may never materialize. It requires the freedom not to be consistent, to contradict ourselves, to change our minds without having to explain or justify these changes to an audience. Another aspect of what we lose when awakening is related to attention and contemplation. In our hyper-connected world, we awaken to an incessant flow of information and stimulus. We have instant access to news from around the world, to vast repositories of knowledge, to infinite entertainment options. We never need to be bored, never need to be unoccupied, never need to sit with our own thoughts without distraction. But this constant external stimulation comes at a cost. We lose the capacity for sustained attention, the ability to delve deeply into a single subject, text, or practice for long periods. We lose the experience of productive boredom, that seemingly empty state that often precedes the deepest creative insights. We lose the practice of contemplation, the patient immersion in a question or problem without the pressure of immediate resolution. The philosopher Josef Pieper argued that contemplation requires a certain receptivity, an openness for the world to reveal itself on its own terms, rather than being grasped and processed according to our goals and projects. In constant connectivity, we lose this receptivity. We are always searching, always processing, always responding. We are rarely simply present, available to whatever may arise. This loss of contemplation has profound implications for our capacity for wisdom. Information is not the same as knowledge, and knowledge is not the same as wisdom. Wisdom requires not only the accumulation of facts and experiences, but their integration, their digestion through sustained reflection. It requires the ability to consider multiple perspectives, to postpone judgments, to sit with paradoxes and contradictions. All of these capacities are hindered by the culture of constant connectivity and instant gratification. There is a certain irony in the fact that many spiritual traditions teach that true awakening comes through stillness, through the reduction of external stimulation, through the slowing down of discursive thought. In contrast, our technological awakening leads us to constant acceleration, to more connections, more information, more possibilities. Perhaps we are confusing one type of awakening with another, seeking expansion, when what we really need is contraction, seeking more when what we really need is less. The Korean philosopher Byung argues that we are living in a society of exhaustion characterized by an excess of positivity, by the constant imperative to do more, be more, connect more. This excessive positivity, paradoxically, drains us. There is no room for negativity in the sense of pause, refusal, limits. There is no room for what he calls the gift of deep listening, the capacity to attend fully to what is present without immediately trying to act on it, change it, or control it. This is perhaps the central paradox of our technological awakening. The more we expand our power and reach through technology, the harder it becomes to experience the kind of attentive presence that many wisdom traditions identify as true awakening. We expand our consciousness in certain dimensions while contracting it in others. The question we face is not whether we should awaken or not. We cannot simply return to a previous state of unconsciousness, nor would it be desirable to do so. The gains in knowledge, freedom, and possibility that accompany our collective awakening are real and valuable. The question is whether we can find forms of awakening that do not require us to completely abandon what we are leaving behind. Can we cultivate sophisticated scientific knowledge while maintaining a sense of wonder and mystery before the natural world? Can we harness the power of digital technologies while preserving spaces for sustained attention and interiority? Can we embrace the freedom of self-definition while creating new forms of belonging and shared meaning? Can we be fully aware of our mortality while living with vitality and joy? I do not have definitive answers to these questions. What I suggest is that any form of awakening worth pursuing should include an awareness of what we are losing in the process. It should include a commitment to carry with us in some form the capacities and experiences that are being threatened by our new modes of consciousness. Perhaps true awakening is not simply adding more layers of knowledge, complexity, and reflexivity to our experience. Perhaps it is the ability to move fluidly between different modes of consciousness, to be fully present in each moment with all the faculties appropriate for that particular moment. There are moments that call for critical analysis and reflection. There are moments that call for technical knowledge and expertise. There are moments that call for sensory immersion and embodied presence. There are moments that call for wonder and receptivity. There are moments that call for intimate connection and vulnerability. There are moments that call for decisive action and moral clarity. To truly awaken could mean not being trapped in any one of these modes, but developing the wisdom to know which is appropriate for each situation and the flexibility to move between them with grace. It could mean integrating our different types of knowledge, honoring both analytical rationality and embodied intuition, both scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom. If we look at the great wisdom traditions of the world, many of them speak of an awakening that transcends and includes earlier levels of development. It is not simply abandoning what came before, but transforming it and integrating it into a new synthesis. Awakening is not linear, but spiral, returning to the same points at increasingly deeper levels of understanding and integration. This more integrative vision of awakening suggests that we do not need to choose between the simplicity of being and the complexity of reflection, between direct immersion in experience and the conceptual understanding of that experience. We can cultivate the capacity to inhabit both modes, to appreciate what each has to offer, to move between them according to the needs of the moment. In practice, this may mean deliberately creating spaces in our lives for different types of experience and consciousness. It may mean regular periods of digital disconnection to allow slower and more embodied forms of attention to flourish. It may mean practices that help us reconnect with the natural world, not only conceptually, but sensorially. It may mean cultivating face-to-face relationships that allow us to experience the embodied presence of other human beings. It may mean creating communities based on shared values and practices which offer a sense of belonging without requiring dogmatic conformity. It may also mean developing a more conscious relationship with our technological tools. Instead of allowing them to structure our consciousness by default, we can learn to use them with more intentionality. We can choose which capacities we want to amplify and which we want to preserve without technological mediation. We can design and select technologies that enhance our autonomy and capacity for attention rather than fragmenting them, as we move toward a future where artificial intelligence and other technologies promise to expand our collective consciousness even further. These considerations become even more important. How can we ensure that our next great awakening does not come at the expense of the human capacities we value most? How can we ensure that it expands our potential rather than diminishing it? How can we ensure that it makes us more fully human, not less? These are questions we need to face collectively through broad and inclusive conversations about the kind of future we want to create. They cannot be left solely to technical experts or market forces. They require the collective wisdom of diverse traditions and perspectives, including those that may seem outdated or irrelevant to the modern eye. If these reflections touched on something you have been feeling, but perhaps had not found words to express, know that you are not alone. By subscribing to the channel, you will connect with a growing community of people who share your concerns and your desire for a deeper understanding of the philosophical challenges of our time. Each week, we meet here to explore together the great questions that define our era and to seek not only understanding, but also wiser ways of living amid the transformations we are witnessing. This is not just a channel, but a space for dialogue and collective growth. Join us in this ongoing journey. Subscribe so we can continue this essential conversation about how to live with more wisdom and purpose in a world that often leaves us disoriented and divided. The awakening I am advocating is not a rejection of modern consciousness or technology. It is not a nostalgic return to some idealized past. It is a more complete integration of different forms of knowledge and experience, a synthesis that honors both what we have gained and what we are at risk of losing. It is an awakening that recognizes that being human has always meant living with paradoxes and contradictions, that there will never be a final resolution to the tensions that define our existence. It is an awakening to complexity, to uncertainty, to the limits of knowledge, but also to the possibilities that exist precisely within those limits. It is, above all, an awakening to our interdependence, to the fact that we are part of systems much larger than ourselves, from our families and communities to planetary ecosystems and the long arcs of human history. It is an awakening to the responsibility that comes with this interdependence, to the fact that our individual and collective choices shape the future in ways we are only beginning to understand. What we lose when we awaken does not need to be lost forever. It can be transformed, integrated, carried with us in new ways. Innocence can become wisdom. Unconscious belonging can become chosen connection. Sensory immersion can become full presence. Acceptance can become commitment. True awakening is not toward separation, but toward connection, not toward judgment, but toward understanding. Not toward control, but toward creative participation in the processes of life and transformation of which we are a part. As we continue on this journey of collective awakening, may we keep alive the memory of what we leave behind, not as a burden of nostalgia, but as a reminder of the capacities and experiences that still define what it means to be human, even as we become something new. The thing is that not in a dictatorship, in a democracy, newspapers and other news outlets are liable for their decisions. Like if the editor of the New York Times decides to publish some conspiracy theory or fake news at the front page of the New York Times, he cannot hide or she cannot hide behind the argument, but free speech. There are some people who believe it's true, so I put it on the front page of the New York Times. No, your job as editor is not just to put something random there or something that would please people. Your job is to fact check and to take responsibility for these decisions and to make sure that if you publish something on the front page of the New York Times, you better be sure that this is accurate and this is responsible. And if you don't know how to do it, then you're in the wrong job.
When the Industrial Revolution erupted, a lot of people said that the only way to build an industrial society is to build an empire. Why? Because you need to control the sources of raw materials and the markets of the industry. So any country that industrialized, first Britain, but also then France and Belgium and Germany and Japan, they all built empires because people thought this is the only way to build an industrial society, with terrible consequences for hundreds of millions of people, not just in India, but in many other parts of the world. Another experiment was totalitarian regimes, that people thought the only way to build an industrial society is to build a totalitarian regime like Nazi Germany or like the Soviet Union, because they thought the only way to control the immense power of industry is if the government controls everything, the economy, society, culture, totalitarianism. Now we know that these were mistakes, that there are better ways to build industrial societies.
I would assume that us having more information and more access to information would lead to more truth, less conspiracy, more agreement, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
No, not at all. Most information in the world is junk. It's like with food. There was a time, like a century ago in many countries, where food was scarce. So people ate whatever they could get, especially it was full of fat and sugar. And they thought that more food is always good. Like if you ask your great grandmother, she would tell, yes, more food is always good. And then we reach a time of abundance. And we have all this industrialized processed food, which is artificially full of fat and sugar and salt and whatever. And it's obviously bad for us. The idea that more food is always good, no. And definitely not all this junk food. And the same thing has happened with information.